Hello, everyone. I have been enjoying a lot of Golden Age detective mystery novels lately, and I just finished reading Trent's Last Case by E.C. Bentley. I picked up this novel for a few reasons, mainly because it appeared on a list of influential novels in the detective genre, and because having been published first in 1913, it's now public domain, so I was easily able to download it as a free ebook. So below I've linked the Project Gutenberg entry if you're interested. There's also a free recording on LibriVox if you like to listen to your books. I do want to mention one warning though, which is that actually some of the brief summaries I read online for this book contain some pretty major spoilers, I'd say. Nothing that gives the entire ending away, but enough to ruin a bit of the surprise. So just keep that in mind if you're actually thinking about reading this book. You might not want to read those until afterwards. Now, to avoid spoiling the novel for any of you, I'm first going to give a general spoiler-free overview of the book, and then I'll go into a major spoiler section. I'm time-stamping this in the description, and I'll mention it as I go, so you know when to jump off if you're not wanting any spoilers. So anyway, this novel was written in 1913 by E.C. Bentley, and despite its name, it's the first of two novels in one short story collection featuring Detective Philip Trent. This novel received praise from several of the most famous Golden Age detective writers, including Dorothy Sayers. Part of the uniqueness of this novel is that unlike earlier detective stories, notably the Sherlock Holmes stories, Trent and the other characters are given more of a human side, which adds some strengths as well as some weaknesses to Trent's investigative abilities, as I'll talk about a bit later. The mystery in this book revolves around the question of who murdered the widely feared and respected but not particularly well-loved Wall Street tycoon Sigsbee Manderson at one of his homes in the British countryside. Early reports of the crime scene suggest that Manderson left his home in the middle of the night, seemingly fully dressed for a day's work. He seems to have then been attacked by an unknown assailant who shot and killed him after a brief struggle, from which scratches can be seen on his arms. Trent arrives at the estate, and after a perhaps implausible dialogue with the local police inspector, we learn that he and Trent are good friends, and he agrees to let Trent snoop around the crime scene and investigate. The first half of the book is, in my opinion, somewhat boring and not the most well written. There's a fairly long introduction to the character of Manderson that I think could and should have been trimmed. I think it would have been easy to give the relevant information and to establish Manderson as a wealthy, feared, and sometimes ruthless businessman without as much description of exactly how he got to that point. Similarly, there's too much explanation about Philip Trent's role as a consultant for this newspaper, including some involvement of characters that aren't really important to the rest of the narrative. So the pacing was not quite right. The mystery itself is slow to develop, and although it might be given a pass since it was one of the earlier mysteries of the era, it fits a sort of formulaic setup where we have an English country estate, a rich guy found dead under suspicious circumstances and his body laying out by the shed, and a handful of servants and other relations who work around the house falling under suspicion and just waiting to be questioned. There's nothing strictly wrong with this setup either, and it makes for some good stories, but the way it's laid out, especially the amount of time it takes to get to the interesting details, is a lower quality than other mysteries of its type. That said, there were enough unusual circumstances highlighted towards the beginning to at least intrigue me a bit. And things do pick up quite a bit in the second half of the novel when we start learning more about what Trent and the others are actually thinking. So before I get into spoilers, I'll say that overall I give this novel 3 out of 5 stars. I'm glad I read it, but for me it didn't really stand out in a way that positively distinguished it from other Golden Age mysteries. Okay, so now I'm going to get into spoilers. If you don't want to know about the investigation itself or how the novel ends, now's your chance to jump off. Okay, so spoilers beginning now. Although this felt like a pretty run-of-the-mill country house murder mystery at first, there were at least a few aspects of the case that are explicitly highlighted and that will catch everyone's attention. On the night before his murder, Manderson shows unusual behavior such as getting into the car to go for an evening ride and then abruptly changing his mind and deciding to walk home. This and other testimonies made it abundantly clear that he was agitated. Also intriguing was the puzzling state in which the body was found, dressed up despite supposedly having already gone to bed, and the puzzling fact that his dentures were still lying in a bowl next to his bed, which seems like something he would have put in immediately if he was getting dressed. Even after the basic interrogations, I can't say I had much of a clue what the motives were for the murder, whom I suspected, or even what aspects of this case might be important, other than the ones explicitly pointed out by the investigators. Unfortunately, partly because of this, there wasn't really quite enough mystery for me by this point. I actually kind of paused reading this book for a few weeks between the first half and the second half, not because I'd given up, but simply because I really couldn't muster enough interest to pick up the book in the evening and see what happened next, so I kept putting it off for later. Compared with other detective stories in which there are pretty much always some interesting leads for me to be thinking about as I read, this one kind of fell short in that sense. Maybe this is a little unfair since it was one of the earlier books of its kind and the formula would be refined by other writers over the years, but that's just how I felt while reading it. One feature of the story that stands out, of course, is that it breaks a few of the rules traditionally associated with the detective genre, as Trent is not a purely rational detective and he lets his emotions get in the way. Detectives aren't supposed to make conclusions simply off of their gut feelings, yet Trent knows as soon as he first sees Mabel Manderson sitting outside that she is innocent, not to mention that he's in love with her. As a result, she's pretty much never considered again with legitimate suspicion, though admittedly after Trent collects some evidence, it does point in a different direction. So the story at times borders on satire, since the detective is, though on point in many ways, also kind of bumbling and blinded by his own emotions. At times, this is sort of admirable and contagious. I actually felt myself getting excited along with Trent as he struggles to contain his enthusiasm whenever he comes up with an idea. At other times, he just seems kind of like a buffoon, especially when he's raving about his dumbstruck admiration for the woman he's just seen for the first time. Because of this, as readers were forced to question whether Mrs. Manderson is really innocent, or whether Trent, in his seemingly blind infatuation, has erroneously dismissed her as a suspect. And by a similar judgment, we later see that Mabel Manderson expresses her conviction that John Marlowe could never kill a man, even though all the evidence seems to point conclusively against him. Now, part of why this works is because eventually we do receive corroborating testimonies or evidence, so we're not forced to simply rely on the characters' judgment of each other to solve the mystery. But the very fact that these hunches about someone's innocence play a real role in the investigative process is a sharp contrast from something like, say, Agatha Christie's Poirot novels, where we're trained as readers to suspect everyone, no matter how innocent or well-intentioned they seem, until hard evidence clears them. And although for some readers this might be unsatisfying, for me it works because in real life I do think there are things that I can intuitively learn about a person's character from interacting with them, and I like that Bentley takes that deeper in this novel. So these aspects do add a bit more humanity to the detective genre as it compared with, say, Sherlock Holmes, but it's still hardly an emotional read since, like others of its whodunit contemporaries, it treats the death of a man not as a macabre or a serious subject, but as the source of a little fun puzzle. So while it works as a device to make the characters more believable as human beings, I wouldn't say it goes as far as to make us readers truly empathize with them on any more than a surface level. And the noir writer would later criticize it along with other whodunit detective fiction on this basis, that it's unrealistic. And while I somewhat agree, I think it's okay in this context because it makes for a more lighthearted kind of mystery. Now, thinking just a minute about the romantic plot of the novel, the way Trent pursued this relationship with Mabel Manderson was certainly a bit questionable, even if psychologically understandable. Showing up at operas every evening to try to cross paths with her, involving himself sometimes intentionally in the same social circles, it all kind of sits on the edge of what's really acceptable and could fairly be called creepy, especially given that he's only interacted with her a few times in what was supposed to be a professional context. And his confession of love once he realizes that there's no money to inherit again seemed in character but also overblown, and I wouldn't have minded if Mabel just turned him down on the spot. Also, considering that Mabel Manderson is one of the most important characters and suspects in the story, her character isn't really developed in a very interesting way, which makes it a little bit less convincing to us as readers that Trent was justified in his instantaneous and seemingly blind trust of her at the beginning of his investigation. So finally, there's the conclusion of the mystery where we learn that Marlowe is guilty, but Trent decides to let him off the hook to avoid scandalizing the woman he loves. Except then it turns out that's not the conclusion. He's innocent, and we learn that actually it was a suicide, and Marlowe just had to cover it up to escape suspicion himself. But then that's not even the answer. And we learn in the final few pages that there's one more twist, which is that he was actually shot by Mr. Couples. Okay, so I really enjoyed the first twist where we learn that Marlowe is innocent in spite of his incredibly suspicious actions on the night of the crime. Things admittedly get a little far-fetched in some points, but this twist resolves pretty much all the loose evidence that didn't quite fit in place. And this gave me the satisfaction and closure that I think probably none of us got just from reading Trent's original account of the events. Plus, it's always nice to see an innocent man cleared. The second twist, though, was less exciting for me. I personally was fine standing on the testimony of Marlowe and all who knew him, and that his story fit perfectly with all the facts, except maybe the one remaining mystery of the scratch marks on the body. Bringing in Mr. Couples to take credit for the murder, but not really a murder, seems kind of irrelevant given how things turned out. And because of this, it all seemed kind of like a cheap thrill sort of ending for me. While the first twist felt very necessary since there were still a lot of open questions, before the second twist even came around, I already felt like everything had been sufficiently resolved. I also thought the second twist kind of undermined one of the unique points of the novel, which is this idea that sometimes intuition, when combined with relevant facts, can be sufficient. No doubt some detective novel purists would have felt unsatisfied without this final piece of the puzzle in place proving Marlowe's innocence. So I expect some people will disagree with me on this, and it makes a lot of sense to me. Anyway, that's a wrap for Trent's Last Case by E.C. Bentley. I'm definitely curious what others thought of it, so leave me a comment below and let me know who you suspected and if you liked the way it ended. Happy reading!